Hey everyone, my name is Lauren Davis, and I have the honor of serving on staff here at Wichita First Church. Wherever you're joining us from, I just want to say thanks for being with us. We're so glad to have you. This past Sunday, we finished up our Origin Story series with a message on the life of Jacob. One of the things that Pastor Scott encouraged us in was finding our fresh start. Much like Jacob, we have to set aside our wants and lives and take on God's blessing for our lives. Each and every one of us has been given the opportunity to have a fresh start. The question is, are we willing and ready to accept it? So excited for you to hear this message today. Let's jump right in.
The teaching text today is Genesis 32, 22 through 31 in the NIV. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all of his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please, tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated.
Well, good morning. So great to see you, whether you're in the room here or joining us online. Before we jump into the message today, I want to tell you just a little update. We have a team that's leaving today for Cactus, Texas. Now, if you don't know where Cactus, Texas is, it's in the panhandle of Texas. And if you're not a part of our church and you don't know who we're connected to, we're part of the Church of the Nazarene. And over the last couple of days, we've had what's called the District Assembly. It was in Hutchinson. And I met there the directors of the ministry center where our team is going. They moved here from South Africa, from Johannesburg, South Africa, which is if you don't know anything about Johannesburg, very large, modern city. They had great jobs. She was the CIO of the largest bank in Africa, and he had a mechanic thing going on, and they left that behind to move to Cactus, Texas. I don't know if you've ever been in the panhandle of Texas. There ain't nothing there. And they moved to Cactus, Texas, and they said, because if you don't know me, I grew up as a little kid in Africa, and we made that connection, and they said, you know what, when you're in Cactus, it's like you're in Africa. There are 30 different nationalities, and they're almost all refugees from different countries, from the Congo, from Guatemala, and they operate this ministry center that meets all kinds of needs, immigration needs, and food needs, and our team's going to go and help them build. Now, they said something really interesting, and I wanted to tell you this because I went, oh, my word, that's powerful. So here's all these people that have been forced to flee terrible situations in their countries, and they come here legally into the United States, and they're sent to this basically refugee camp in Cactus, Texas, where there's a food packing plant that's a Brazilian company. And they said, we've heard this again and again. People will come from these other countries, and they'll see the name on the sign that says, Church of the Nazarene, and they'll go, oh, in my country, that's a safe place. Those people will help us. So why am I telling you that? One, pray for our team as they go. They're going to be meeting a tremendous need there, helping them in a tremendous way. But I want you to know also, when you give, which we're going to worship with giving at the end of the service today, what you're doing is you're giving to the global Church of the Nazarene, and you're making things like that possible in Cactus, Texas. I hope you see the connection there. And I wanted you to hear that and know that. Well, before we jump into the message, I want to invite you, would you pause and pray with me? Let's ask for God's help today. Lord, we want to hear from you, and so I pray that the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts would be acceptable in your sight. Lord, you're our rock, and you're our Redeemer, so help us to see stability today. Help us to see the path that we need to take today. We want to respond to your Spirit working in our life, so we're listening. We pray this in your name. All God's people said, amen. One of the tasks in life and leadership is simple. It's simple, but it's complex. The task in leadership in life is to go from here to there. You're going from here to there. So let's just say, if you want to make progress in life, what you have to do, again, it's simple but complex. You have to go from here to there. If you're a leader, if you, in any capacity, say you manage a department, or you have a small team, or you have a large team, or you own a whole business, whatever it is, you are tasked with taking that entity, those people, from here, wherever you are, there, wherever it is you want to go. That's a beautiful definition of what leadership entails. And life's no different, right? You have to figure out, how do I go from here, where I am, to there? Now, here's what this entails. That's why it's simple but complex. To go from here to there always requires change. Now, listen, nobody likes change. You've heard the phrase, right? The only people who like change are the people who decide what the change is going to be, and babies, right? Only people. Nobody else likes change. We had a guest at our house. Our kids have other kids come over, and we were eating dinner, and we said, "Hey, do you want to eat dinner?" And we were getting ready to sit down at the table, and this girl who didn't understand how the world works, sat in my seat at the kitchen table. Do you know what I'm talking? Like, I don't like change. I'm not sitting somewhere else. That's my chair. Nobody likes change. So why do people change? Why do people say, I've got to go from here to there? I've discovered, I think this holds true, that there's really only two reasons that you go there. Number one, you say there is better than here. And you say, I've got a better vision for where my life could be. I've got a better vision for where my business could be. I've got a better vision for where my family could be. I've got a better vision of what friendship, I've a better vision of what I want happening in my body. So I'm going to go there. I've got a better vision. And so you say, I'm going to change. I'm going to do what's necessary here to change so I can go there. But at the same time, here's what I've discovered, my own self and watching people. That's pretty small percentage. The other reason that people change, now nobody likes this, is pain. The pain of staying right here is so great that you say, you know what? I've got to go there. I've got to figure out where there is, and I've got to get myself up off this couch, and I got to go there. Now, we're Christians, and I told you this last week, so I said, we believe in conversion. We believe that you have to change your life before God. You have to rethink everything, your set of values, your life strategies, and you have to be converted. You have to be changed. It's fundamental. I told you a story last week about a guy named Chuck Colson. I said that for those of you who are young in the room, and for those of you who are old in the room, you know he was the hatchet man for Richard Nixon. He famously said, I would walk over my own grandmother to re-elect Richard Nixon as the president. He was not a nice man. And the part of his story was he ended up in jail as a result of what he did in that administration. And he went through, while in that whole process, he went through a conversion. Now, why am I telling you about conversion? Well, what we're talking about is this story we looked at that Michael read for us, and if you were here last week, we read last week as well. That conversion, when you say, I'm going to rethink my life, that's a pattern that you lay down. And you say, okay, when I come up against something I don't know what to do when I'm here and I know I need to go there, I already understand what I have to do. I have to rethink my life. I have to repent before God. I need God's help. I have to be converted again. You have to have a fresh start. And so I asked you last week, I'll ask you again this week because that's an important question. Do you need a fresh start? Do you need a fresh start? You're in the right place. If you're going to go from here to there, 3 realities. We talked about one of them last week. We had a medical emergency, and we didn't finish the last two. So is anybody need a medical emergency? Anyone? Just real quick. Make sure we got that out of our system. You have to do 3 things. I'll recap what I talked about last week, and then we'll talk about the other 2. You have to deal with if you're going to go from here to there, you have to deal with what's behind you. Talked about the past. And then you have to know who it is that you're actually wrestling with in the present moment. And then how do you find the blessing? How do you get it? deal with what's behind you. I told you last week that past for people is 3 W's. It's often a whip, a wound, or weather. The whip means you're trying to outrun your past. The wound means things have either been done to you, and so you are protective, or things you're trying to make up for, and so you adopt a corrective stance in the world. And if the past functions like weather, it's the circumstances of your past you think are the current circumstances of your present. And so you can't live in the present moment because you're stuck in a past moment. And I said this to you, if you don't come to terms with what's behind you, it will continue to define you. That's fundamental. And then we're here about Jacob's life. Now, this scene in Jacob's life, just to give you a little more context than last week, is actually the climactic moment of Jacob's entire life. We're kind of looking at the zenith moment of his life when everything changes for him. And if you understand this about his life, you know a lot happened. Jacob was parented poorly. If you were parented poorly and you've got some animus toward your parents, you were not alone. That was Jacob. His parental sin was that they played favorites. They gave him a terrible name. They gave him the name Jacob, literally in the Hebrew means a trickster or a liar. Can you imagine if you name your kid, and I know it's a different thing today, you name your kid, and when you go to introduce your kid, you said, oh, look everybody, this is our son, Liar. That's essentially what they. What kind of parental sin is it to give your kid a name like that? And names become destiny, and that became his destiny. He became a trickster. He was searching all of his life. Can you blame him for the love of his father because his father loved his older brother more? Can you blame him? And Esau was his favorite, and if you know, again, his story a little bit, he goes and steals from Esau a cultural blessing that was bestowed by his father. He steals it. He thinks, I'm going to get what is coming to me my father has not given to me by his parental sins, and I'm going to steal it. And the response from Esau is, then I'm going to kill Jacob. And so Jacob flees, and he goes to live with his uncle. I told you last week, his uncle Laban, the word name Laban means confuser, so the trickster meets the confuser. Remember that from last week? And here's this climactic moment in Jacob's life when it's all coming to the fore. Everything's building to this moment. The reason he's at this river Jabbok is that he's going back to meet his brother Esau, who swore he would kill him. He's got to face his past. It's all coming together for him in this moment. And this is when he has this defining encounter with God. Jacob finally begins to deal with what's behind him, and he can't avoid it anymore, and he just can't go through life anymore. He has to wrestle. Now, this is where we left off last week. We talked about who it is that you're wrestling with. That night, the text says, and I said to you last week, hey, we've all had that night moments, like, hey, it's all coming. Here it is. I got to deal with it. I can't ignore it any longer. And I told you about this, and about that there's this kind of wordplay in the Hebrew that is we miss in the English, and it would kind of, if you were reading it in the English, it would be like Jacob crosses the Jabbok, and then Jacob jabs. That would be like the English equivalent of it. And what the writer is doing in a skillful, artistic way is saying that, Jacob, it's you, this is the place, and this is the time. This is the moment. We were taking our oldest son to college orientation a couple months ago, and the chapel speaker got up, and he said this thing again and again, stuck with me, and he said, this is the place, you are the one, and this is the time. And he was trying to say, listen, this is a defining moment in your life. And that's what's happening in the text. Pay attention. And so Jacob is left alone there, and a man wrestles with him until daybreak. Now, I've told you all the way through this series that these stories in Genesis are two things. They are a mirror to us. So when we look into these stories, we're meant to see ourselves, and they are a window into the character of God. And what we discover is that Jacob, all of his life, has been wrestling. He's been wrestling with his upbringing. He's been wrestling with what his parents did to him. He's been wrestling with the fact that he didn't get the blessing from his parents that he desperately needed. He's been wrestling with his brother. He's been wrestling with what he thinks his brother is going to do to him. He's been wrestling with his sense of unfairness. Now, the text is saying something to us. I don't want you to miss this because this is very important to you making it from here to there. You have to understand who it is in your life that you're actually wrestling with. Here's what the text tells us. You thought it was all of those kinds of things that you were wrestling with. And the text says, I'm going to tell you who you're wrestling with. You're actually wrestling with God. That's who you're wrestling. All your life, all these other things have come up, and you're like, what about this? Or what do people think about me? And who you're actually wrestling with is God. You're wrestling with what God wants, who God is in your life, the will of God for your life, the purpose of God for your life, the shape of the character God's putting into you. Listen. The universe is not a giant mirror in which all we see is ourselves. That's not what it is. That's not what's happening. If you thought that was it, that's not it. The writer to the Hebrews, he says something really interesting. He's talking about how we're uncovered in our life. And this is what he says. I'll put it on the screen for you. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give account. I actually love the King James version right there that's in that phraseology. The way it's translated is, not to whom we must give account, but the one with whom we have to do. Let's introduce that kind of language back, right? The one with whom we have to do. The text is trying to tell you, listen, the one with whom you have to do in the end is God. This is the record all the way through Scripture. You've maybe never seen this, but this is the record all the way through Scripture. Recorded in the New Testament is Saul, who breathes out these murderous threats against the early Christians. He's a Jewish leader, and he has this encounter with Jesus. Do you know this story in Acts chapter 9? I'll put it on the screen for you. He has this encounter with Jesus, and he's been wrestling all of his life. He's been wrestling with what's righteousness and what it means to be a follower of God, what it means to have zeal, what it means to be a good person. He's been wrestling with all of these things all of his life. And what does Jesus say to him? Saul, Saul, why do you persecute who? Oh, I didn't hear you. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute who? Persecute who? Me, right? Saul, you've been wrestling with me. You could go to Jonah in the Old Testament, where Jonah ran away, and what the text says, he hears this message from God. God, I need you to go tell these people that I love him. The people you don't like, you don't agree with, your values don't line up, you don't vote the way that they do. I love them. I'm sending you to them. And Jonah doesn't want to go, and so he wrestles with his life. And what's the text say? But Jonah ran away from the Lord. That's who he was really wrestling with. Who are you really wrestling with in your life? This story is trying to tell you, God. That's who you're wrestling with. Now, I want to give you if you're taking notes, 5 pastoral insights into the wrestle. 5 pastoral insights into the wrestle. Here they are. Number 1. First, likely, you're going to be confused. Text, again, says that, this man wrestled with him until daybreak. You're going to think, you're going to not understand. You're going to go, no, why am I facing these things in my life? Why is it hard? Why do I feel the things that I feel? Jacob was expecting the next day that he was going to have to, in some way, metaphorically, maybe physically, wrestle with Esau, and in a sense, this is what he's been doing all of his life. In fact, if you back up a few verses from this passage in Genesis 32, what you find out is that he wrestles with Esau in a financial way, and he sends ahead multiple groups, just because Jacob had become very wealthy, essentially an endowment, multiple herds, multiple servants, to try and appease Esau, because that's who he thinks he's wrestling with. He's confused. And it's only later in the story where he finds out that it was actually God. So if you're confused and you're like, well, wait a second, I don't understand what you mean, Scott. You wrestle with God. What are you talking about? If you're confused about your wrestle in life, that's normal. You're likely going to be confused when you wrestle. Number 2 is that the wrestle will go on for a while. The text says, so Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Now, again, this is an artistic text. The narrative is not accidental. The word choice is not, that sounds good. It's intentional. That can mean multiple things. It can mean all night long. A night can be a night in your life. But a night can also be a season. You go to Alaska in the summer, and you go far enough north, you know what happens? For an entire season, you do not see the light. Have you been there? It's like, how long is this going to go on? Like, I'm struggling. What do I do? The wrestle is, just telling you, this story saying, this text from the Word of God is saying it's just going to go on for a minute. Third thing is that you will be, and this is maybe the hardest thing to get about the wrestle with God, is you will be wounded in the process. Genesis 32:25, when the man saw that he could not overpower him, this man he doesn't understand is God, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Now, is that metaphorical? Is that literal? Well, Jacob doesn't walk the same again, meaning he's not going to go through the world in the same way again. There's all kinds of layers to this. He's marked by this encounter with God. The fact that he's encountered the living God changes him in some way. Now, this is difficult for us because how do we make sense of being wounded by God? How do you have a cat? God would wound you? What are you saying? If you were to go to the Psalms, you would find repeated things where the psalmist says in the Psalms are the middle book in the Bible. It's songs and poetry that have been the prayer book of God's people for a couple thousand years. Great way if you don't know what to pray, go to the Psalms, pray the Psalms. Beautiful. But you find this repeated thing where it's like people are complaining to God. And if you grew up in certain ways of understanding faith, you think, well, is that okay? Can I do that? Now, I'll give you one. Here's Psalm chapter 60, verse 1-3. You have rejected us, God, and burst upon us. You've been angry. Now restore us. You've shaken the land and torn it open. Mend its fractures, for it's quaking. You've shown your people, God, you have shown your people desperate times. You've given us wine that makes us staggered. Now, what are they saying? God, you've wounded us. Why is this happening? I want to give you a pastoral answer. Can you go with me here? Proverbs 17, verse 3 says, the crucible for silver and the furnace of the Proverbs is a book of wisdom. It's all these kind of aphorisms, these sayings about what it means to be a wise person. The crucible for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord, what's the word there? I don't like it. Tests the heart. Let me translate. When things are hard in your life, that's a test. My son one of my sons loves auto racing. And so I've kind of gotten into that world a little bit, not much, but a little. And what I've discovered is that there's actually when they test a car, they take it out and they take it to the proving ground. Do you know why they're testing the car? Are they trying to make the car suffer? Are they trying to say that the car is worthless? Are they trying to say that the car just couldn't quite get it together? No, they take it out to see where the flaws are so that the car can be the car that it was designed to be. And they want to reveal the flaws so that the car can function the way the car is supposed to function. Are you following? So let me reframe for you for a second, if you can. When you go through something hard and it's a test, this is actually a divine compliment. The Lord, the creator of heaven and earth, who created you. Have you ever made something, it might be a pie, it might be a spreadsheet, it might be a piece of wood, I don't know. You've made something, and you as the designer understand what it can handle. Do you know what I'm talking about here? Do you understand what's happening here? Is that the Lord, your creator, knows something about you that you don't know about yourself. The Lord knows that you are stronger than you think you are. Did you know that? You are actually stronger than you think. Maybe you got all these messages that come into your head. Well, I don't know why I should have done this. I should have been better. Why did I do this? No. The Lord, who made you, understands and knows that you are stronger than you think you are. And listen, this is hard. Okay, I understand. Sometimes pain is the only way to get you and I to change. Remember what I said about change, right? You really, it's only the preferred future, but it's almost always pain. Now, let me just give a caveat here. I'm not saying that if you get cancer, God gave you cancer to improve your character. We don't see it that way. As Wesleyans, we understand that death is the last enemy that will be defeated, and that Jesus defeated death on the cross by his resurrection and brought into the world a new way of living, a new power into the world, and in the end will make everything the way it was on Easter Sunday morning, including, you lost anybody, it's coming back. There's a new heaven and a new earth coming. That's what we believe. So I'm not trying to say that. But I am trying to say to you, often difficulty is God's tool to help you see. C.S. Lewis, famous atheist, became a follower of Jesus. His relationship with J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings, and then C.S. Lewis wrote all these wonderful works. And he married this lady named Joy, and it was later in his life, and then she died. And C.S. Lewis wrote a book about that, A Grief Observed, and he said something in it that's so what is happening here in this text. I want to tell you what he said. He said, listen, God whispers to us in our pleasures, but shouts to us in our pain. If you're wrestling, you're saying, well, I don't know if I like that. I don't know if I like being wounded. God, listen. Everybody big I know walks with a limp. Everybody. I don't know anybody who's a big person. I mean, bigness of soul and heart. I don't know one that doesn't have a limp. Do you? Fourth thing is that you're going to have to, when in the wrestle, you have to confront yourself. So you're going to wrestle God, but you're also going to wrestle you. And if you wrestle just you, you'll probably never wrestle God. But then I want you to notice what happens with Jacob is he says, the man asked him, this is God, Jacob, what is your name? It seems, why would you ask that? I mean, you know who you're wrestling. What does Jacob say? He says his name, Jacob, trickster, liar, cheater. He answered. In other words, the text is saying, listen, God's asking Jacob, who have you been to this point? And to this point, Jacob thinks that his problem has always been someone else or something else. He's never understood the problem. He's always thought it was somebody else's problem. And he's never stopped to ask how it is that he's contributed to the problem. In the scriptures, your name is your character. And God's saying, Jacob, what's your character? What's your name? Who are you? So the wrestle isn't about the things that you've done in the world. Wrestling is not about you self-actualizing. Wrestling is not about you accomplishing something. Wrestling is not about you just working out the flaws so you can be a better you. It's not for the sake of you propping up Project Self so that you can win in life. Wrestle is about the kind of person that you are. That's what the wrestle is about. If you've been around, you know I trot this illustration out a couple times a year. It's time. You're welcome in advance. G.K. Chesterton was a luminary in England. He was very well respected, follower of Jesus. The Times, the London Times, whatever the paper was, we had all these luminaries, like we would do today. You know, what do all these celebrity kinds of people, these thought leaders, what do they think about the world? And they asked for essays on the question, what's wrong with the world? Right? That's a very modern question. Like, what is happening in the world today? What's going on here? And all these people wrote in these long essays. G.K. Chesterton, if you've ever read any of his work, powerful. He just cut through everything. This is what he said. 4-word response. You've been around. You know exactly what he said. He said, in response to the question, Dear sirs, he said, what's wrong with the world? This is what he said. Dear sirs, I am. What is he saying? I recognize that I contribute to the problem. I can't blame somebody else. And Jacob is being asked by God, Jacob, what's wrong with the world? Do you see? Do you understand? This is a key moment, Jacob. Will you own it? And then, number 5, in wrestling with God, pastoral insights, at the end, you'll see. Now, I'm trying to do kind of almost a fool's errand. I'm trying to describe with words an experiential encounter with God. I'm trying to say to you that there's this experience that you can have with God, and that if you have with God, it will fundamentally transform who you are. I'm trying to give language to something that's meant to be an experience. It's like saying to someone who's never tasted honey, honey is so sweet. If you've never tasted it, you don't know. And so what I'm trying to say to you is this text is telling us that you have to go through it to fully understand it. So the text says that at the end, Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God. He finally sees who he was up against. I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. And then he goes in for the blessing. Verse 35, then the man said, let me go for its daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. That's what we want. We want the blessing. I want to tell you two things the blessing does for you, and then we're going to receive communion together in just a minute. First is very clear. It's in the text, verse 28. The man said, your name will no longer be trickster, no longer be deceiver, no longer be who you were. Jacob, you see who you've been. You're not that person anymore, but now Israel, which means to wrestle with God. El is the suffix there for God. You have wrestled with God and with humans, and you've overcome. So the first thing that when you finally get the blessing that you are looking for all of your life is you get a new name, you get a new identity. Israel, wrestle with God. It's kind of almost like he's been Jacob and he becomes Israel, the one who wrestles with God. If you know the story of Daniel in the Old Testament, it's almost a reverse Daniel. Daniel's name means Daniel, which means God is my judge. And when he's taken off to Babylon, his name is changed by this foreign culture to Belshazzar, which means Bel was a demon. You worship this demon now. We're trying to change who you are. And it's almost like a reverse. Jacob loses everything and becomes Israel, but he can't become Israel until he loses Jacob. Do you follow? Jacob is the old identity. It's his ego. And Jacob is converted like Chuck Colson. The hatchet man, he goes from being the hatchet man to God's beloved. Frederick Buechner said, he called this the magnificent defeat. Isn't that beautiful? He went through the magnificent defeat, and the text says, touches his hip. Here's what happened. Because up until that point, for the whole night, he's been wrestling, and it's like they're equals. And Jacob thinks, wrestling someone who's my equal. And then God simply touches his hip. So he realizes in a moment who it is that he's actually wrestling with. And it's God that's been holding back all night. And in a moment, he sees. He's like, this is who can actually bless me in my life. I've looked for it in all the other places. This is who can actually bless me. And so he gets a new name, a new identity. Second thing, here's what it does. When you get the blessing, it replaces need with love. It replaces need with love. He's wanted this blessing all of his life. In fact, it's what he tried to steal from Esau. But what he discovered in his lived experience was that what he thought he stole from Esau never fully satisfied. What does it mean to be blessed? That means that you're praised. You're seen as enough. The Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 2, he has this really interesting phrase that he says. We talked about it earlier in the year where he says something interesting to you and me. He says, hey, listen, the way you want to get along with other people is do nothing out of selfish ambition, and then he uses this phrase, vain conceit, which we don't talk like that. It's actually someone who doesn't understand the blessing. They can't actually ever do that because they're trying to use people to fill a need. They're just always need. It's like, I got to have more. Use you. Use this. Use that. But that word there is actually the Greek word is kenodoxa, which is two words put together. It means empty. Kenosis means to empty something. Doxa is glory. It's empty glory. Old translations call it vain glory. Do nothing out of vain glory. Do nothing out of empty glory. Let me translate. Don't do anything out of the hole in your soul. It just won't ever work. And that's what Jacob's been doing to this point. He's been operating out of the hole in his soul about his glory deficit. He can't quite get it. Now, here's how we know that he actually found the blessing. He realized it was God who could finally satisfy him. If you go ahead to Genesis chapter 33, the next day he gets up and he goes off to meet his brother Esau. And in Genesis chapter 33, verse 11, he gives all these gifts, and Esau meets him, and instead of trying to kill him, hugs him and weeps, falls on his neck, and they weep. And there's this beautiful moment of reconciliation, and all that went in the past is forgiven, and it's a new start to their relationship. And Esau tries to say to him, all these things you sent ahead, these herds, I don't need them. Here, take them back. I've got plenty. And again, none of the text is wasted. None of the words are wasted. Genesis 33:11, Jacob says, I have all I need. What does he understand? Esau, I'm not the same person. I've found the true blessing. I've been looking for it all my life. I thought it was you. It's not. And then Genesis 33:18, again, words are not wasted. He arrives, in the original language, the NIV translated as safely. It's the word shalom. He arrives whole. He arrives complete. That's what the story is saying. Like, listen, you've been searching all your life. You've been using people. You don't have to do that. I love this at the end of Chuck Colson's life. He, as a result of his conversion, he founded a ministry because he spent time in prison, and he discovered that everyone in prison, that's how he said it. He said, in prison is filled with embittered prisoners who contemplate escape and revenge at every turn. And he realized they were looking for the blessing, and he said, I'm going to figure out a way to minister to prisoners. And he started this, or it's still an organization even after he's passed away, called Prison Fellowship. Powerful organization that meets the needs of prisoners, tells them the good news, the gospel, that they can find the blessing. And this is what he said at the end of his life. He's trying to sum up all these horrible things that had happened to him. I put it on the screen for you. He said, was I ever wrong? God used my greatest defeat for his glory. Man, he discovered what Jacob discovered. The blessing. That's the message of the gospel.